What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name's Phillip Russell, and I'm with my co-host,
Ben Thorp.
And Ben, this week we talked to author Victor LaValle about his new novel, Lone Women, and we also just get into kind of his whole journey as, an author, and also his affinity toward horror as being a key element in his work. And this was a really, really cool conversation, and one that I've been really thinking about in terms of like my own writing.
Yeah, I think this is it's interesting. We've been doing a lot of I feel like games and games media stuff, and this is one where it's like, oh, back to literature, baby. Like, it feels honestly pretty good. And Victor, at least for me, and I know to some extent for you, is someone who I'd been reading for a little while and was like, this is cool. I can't believe that this person said yes to an interview. Like, let's go. Mm-hmm. So I was pretty excited about this.
Yeah, and we touch from everything. Like, if you haven't read Lone Women, which just came out in the last month or two, we do a pretty good job of kind of giving you the context for the novel, and we definitely broaden the conversation to just talk about literary fiction, speculative fiction, and maybe how genre really doesn't matter. So if anything, I think this is a really elucidating conversation if you're a writer yourself and one who's trying to get that novel done. So how about for this conversation, we'll let it play and we can jump into the more of the specifics in the outro. Victor LaValle is the author of a short story collection, 5 novels, and also the creator and writer of 2 comic books. His novel, The Changeling, will soon be appearing on Apple TV, starring LaKeith Stanfield. He has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the World Fantasy Award, British Fantasy Award, Bram Stoker Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as many more. And he was raised in Queens, New York, where he now lives in the Bronx with his wife, the writer Emily Rabateau, and their kids, and he teaches at Columbia University. Victor, thanks so much for coming on and talking with us.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Congratulations on Lone Women coming out. As an author of many, many books and other projects, I'm curious, at this point in your career, what does it feel like to kind of release this new project? Do you still have that same excitement, or how do you approach a book launch these days?
Well, it's a different feeling, actually. I will say, what I've come to see now is when I published my first book, I wasn't aware of it, but secretly, what I thought would happen after I published it would be that all my insecurities would disappear. All my pain and resentment about the things that that I felt were the pains of my childhood would be healed. And that I would be a endlessly happy person from that moment on. As I say, I didn't know that that's what I thought, but that is what I felt and thought. And so when that didn't happen, I was deeply unhappy for much of the time in the early stages of when I published that book, when all I should have been was thrilled. And it's because I was asking that book to do things a book can't do. And so by this stage now, I've been to therapy. I think I can compartmentalize the idea of when a thing does, what a thing is meant to do and what it's not meant to do. And so now, with the latest book, when it comes out, I'm just celebrating it. I'm thrilled to talk about it and to talk with people about it. I'm overjoyed when people review it or talk about it and they say that they enjoy it. And then when people say that they hate it or they say that they're confused by it or whatever like that, it doesn't sting in the same way. I'm disappointed. I'm saddened that I wish everybody would love everything, but I take it more as okay, it just wasn't for them. That's fine. And for these people, it was. And all of it just feels like a gift in a way that it didn't used to.
Can you almost talk a little bit more about that? I think that mentality, I'll just say I feel sometimes that in myself, where I'm yes. If I put out this piece and it's successful, then I won't,
Yes,
I'll finally feel okay about who I am as a person.
absolutely.
Like, where does that come from? And like, how did you kind of grapple with that?
Well, I mean, certainly it comes from whatever the slings and arrows of existence are, right? I mean, more broadly speaking, maybe, again, not everybody feels this way. Some writers, I think, are enter or creative people of any kind enter into a moment and they have been equipped to understand that this is not meant to solve all those issues. But in a weird way, I would say success of whatever kind is a lot like money in the United States in that nobody talks about it and nobody tells you how you're supposed to deal with it.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, uh, like people who are immediately successful out the gate, how do you explain that to other people? Because you're so busy just trying to um, fit into yourself. Like, how did I make this happen? And the answer probably is like, you didn't make it happen alone, right? And on the other side of it, when a thing doesn't blow up, turn into something people love, get published, whatever it might be, um, the impulse is, well, what did I do wrong? What? And the answer might be nothing, right? It was good. It just didn't connect. It came out too early. It came out too late, whatever it might be. So, but I think like, I don't know that there's actually like training for that, or forget even training, conversations about that, because it can be embarrassing or painful, I think, to admit, like that I was vain enough that I wanted this to succeed. And by succeed, I meant like honestly, like before I published that first book, I had it in my mind. I was going to make enough money off of the book sale to buy an apartment in
Hmm.
Tribeca. And the picture I had was, and every Sunday I'd have over all my other cool art literati friends. And I had this image, I would open the fridge and there would be all these bottles of champagne and orange juice. And I would just be making mimosas. And I have this spicy Bloody Mary mix that I like to make. And that's how I'd spend Sundays. And in no way did that come anywhere near close to happening. Right. But if that's your sort of like picture of success, then your book being published and it's in the world and it's reviewed in some great places, somehow you can make that into like, meh, yeah, didn't work out. Or man, the world owed me more, something like that, whatever it is. And I just think like most people don't talk about how they succeeded or how they failed at a thing, you know, because both can be kind of
Hmm.
embarrassing and mysterious, right? And so if I don't talk about it, then how to say like in my students, how do they know what the path even could be? Forget about like there's one way to do it, but just here's one
Hmm.
here's one way it could go. And then you could gauge to yourself, well, like he published his book and was miserable. I'm going to publish my book and be half miserable, you know? And in that way you learn. And then that person tells the next person, and that person decides, I'm going to publish this book and find a way to just enjoy
Hmm.
it, you know? Um, that would be my feeling about that.
How much do you still? I was reading an interview with you where you were talking about like, oh, I had these unhealthy tendencies maybe early on when stuff would come out to just scroll through the Goodreads and be like, what are people saying about it? But on the
Right.
flip, I can also see like, maybe there's enjoyment out of being like, oh, here's how people are responding to or reacting to or feeling about this thing that I made in a positive way. And I don't know, do
Hmm.
you still, is that something that you engage with at all now? Or now you're like, I put this thing out of the world and I will not engage with any of the discourse around it?
Oh no, I still look at all the Goodreads and all that stuff. But but I think the the way I don't know if you saw recently there was that I know she acted terrible, but I do feel some empathy for that young woman who had a book on Goodreads. She went on TikTok. It was like not out yet. She had 5-star ratings based on who knows 50 reviews, 100, some very small number of reviews. Um, and then one person gave her 4 stars. And so she went on TikTok and was like, this bitch ruined my 5-star rate. And it turned into like she was dropped by her publisher, I think.
Oh wow.
Uh,
Hmm.
People went on her Goodreads and gave her like 175,000 one-star reviews, right? Like that's the worst case scenario. Like that author acted terribly, but I don't believe she deserved that level of backlash for what was essentially, I can't tell you, especially early on, how many times I'd sit there, I'd see somebody give me a 4-star review, and I'd be like, you piece of shit, you absolute toilet of a human being. Why couldn't you just do 5? Or whatever it is, you know? Um, but thankfully, I had the good sense or good friends to know, like, just don't type that. Just leave it alone, you know? Um, and so by now, when I do look at the Goodreads, but I much less often than I used to, but I'll pop in just to see how things are going. And my take on it is like every opinion on there gets to just be its opinion from 1 to 5 stars. And uh, sometimes I, like if I'm reading through it, somebody has like a decent point. I'll like sometimes it'll be like with Lone Women, it's a historical novel, but it also has horror in it. And so there'll be some people who'll be like, this book would have been great if it didn't have any horror in it. And I can't be mad at that. I'm like, okay, it's just not what you like. And then there'll be other people who'll say like, this this book would have been great if it had more horror in it. And I go like,
Hmm.
okay, it's just not for you. But in a way now I can see that. I can see what they're talking about. And then I can just turn it off and move on. Uh, and I credit that to hopefully being older, to having other things going on. I'm married, we have kids, I have other work I'm doing. I don't have the energy to give that as much time as I used to and just stew on it, you know. 10 seconds of being annoyed or 10 seconds of being elated, and then I got to go pick my kids up from school. And that helps to wash a bunch of that out of my brain.
Yeah, well, I mean, I bet, with the release of Lone Women, it's probably been a really interesting experience for you to kind of, delve into the Goodreads and all the reactions because the setting and the type of story it is a lot different than maybe some of your previous work. And, for listeners who maybe haven't read Lone Women yet, it's set in the backdrop of the Homesteaders Act and kind of women being able to, you know, uh, take on free land in the country as long as they're able to, kind of manage it themselves through the government. And it follows a black woman named Adelaide Henry who's kind of running away from this traumatic past in some way with this trunk that has a supernatural element without kind of giving anything away. And a lot of your other work is much more entrenched in cityscapes. And I think maybe just to start us off with this novel, like, could you just talk a little bit about where this fascination with Montana and this kind of time period came from when you were starting this project?
Yeah, well, really what happened is a decade ago, I was doing an event at the University of Montana, and I try to make a practice when I do a visit at a place where I think I probably might never come back to again. I try to buy a book of local history
Mm-hmm.
because most events I'm there 2 days. I fly in, I'm there that day doing my reading or meeting students. Next day I fly out. So you can't really learn about a place in that kind of time. So the book is my way of almost like later saying, what was that place I went to? And what's something
Mm-hmm.
interesting about that place? Even if I don't go back, I'll know a little something more. And it expands. I'm a kid from New York, born and raised, never really traveled outside of New York State until I was probably 25, I think, 20,
Mm-hmm.
maybe 23. So really like non a worldly kid. And so that's another way for me to expand my picture of the world. But anyway, while I was at this University of Montana bookstore looking through their local history section, I found this book called Montana Women Homesteaders, A Field of One's Own. And it was all about women homesteaders, a group of people I did not know existed at all. And then I realized as I was reading it, I had all these preconceived notions about what this would mean. So my first preconceived notion was like, oh, when you say women homesteaders, you mean the wives or the daughters or the mothers of the men, right? Like that's what I would have thought. That's what I did think. But the whole point of this was like, no, these are widows or single women going out on their own. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I said, okay, so they're all white, right? Because that would be who they were. And he said, no, there were some black, there were some Latina, but there were no Chinese allowed because the Chinese Exclusion Act was in place. So out west at that time, the ethnic group who was the most legally sort of like at war, the nation was most at war with was actually the Chinese. And that was fascinating to me. And then, of course, you have like the actual indigenous population and the fact that they couldn't homestead yet, but in a few years they could, and it was all so much more complicated
Hmm.
than my picture of what Montana in 1915 would be. And what I realized was like, oh, it's just because all I know is what I've seen on TV and movies, right? That's what I know. And it turns out what I know is nothing. But then I said, but maybe I'm just some kid from New York. Maybe everyone else knows this and I'm just slow. So then I reached back out to folks who I'd met at the university, folks who'd grown up in Montana, two, three generations, and then folks who had moved there recently. And I said, do you know these lone women? Have you heard about these women? And to a person, they all were like, they were lone women
Hmm.
homesteaders. And they were surprised. And that's when I was like, okay, if even you don't know and you are generations back, then maybe I have a story to tell. And that really was the thing that was like the path of wanting to tell that story. But what coincides with that also is that in 2017, I published this novel called The Changeling, which is this sort of weird fairy tale set in New York City. And it's deeply, deeply, deeply about New York City history and about making New York City weird. But after I was done writing it, I was really sick of New York City, which is my hometown and is the place I write about. And I was dying to write about just anywhere else. And then Montana in 1915 absolutely was the complete opposite to New York City across the 2000s. And so I said, okay, just even for me, just to feel excited again, that's where I'm going to go.
I love everything that you're saying. Phil and I just got off in our previous interview was with the creator of a game called Pentiment, which was also really interested in history and how much of history kind of gets lost in the retelling, that so often we
Yes.
just have a couple of documents and those are turned into the entire story. And there's a line
Mhm.
in your book that gets repeated again and again, which is that the history is simple, but the past is complicated. Even though, obviously Lone Women has some of these fantastical elements, the
Mhm.
approach is still grounded in this real history. I was looking up I think it's Lucerne Valley, where you talk about the
Yes.
black farmers when we start in California. That's real. How do you
Yes.
think about representing the past, and telling these stories, even though it's a novel that does also have some of these fantastical elements?
Well, one of the sort of very soft rules that I made for myself was that, except for the issue of what's in the trunk, everything else in the book would be something I had corroborated
Hmm.
in my research. So, like, there, like every single other detail you find in there, if someone was to say, "Well, this can't be true," or "This can't be true," I'll find you the passage, I'll find you the article, I'll find you the thing, because I really wanted it to feel um, like in a way, to a lot of people, the the stuff that wasn't supernatural would feel as unrealistic or as surprising as the supernatural thing, because most of us have so little knowledge about these things, right? And so to learn, like you said, to learn about these Black farming communities in Southern California, and to know that they all came out there to essentially to homestead there, right, and to make these towns, and that they were these thriving Black towns of farmers. I'm not saying it seems supernatural, but it is not a general part of our American history lessons or our TV shows. Like when you say it's a show about a farmer or a book about a farmer or a movie about a farmer or a song about a farmer, very few people think, oh, you mean the Black farming families of Lucerne Valley? No, nobody does. And so that was it. That was a kind of like excitement for me when like each of these things I could be like, oh yeah, the Mexican couple who live up on a mountain. I'll show you the book that I took that inspiration from a book called Diary of a Woman Homesteader, where she met this couple and blah 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 blah, and there was such pleasure in it for me. And there's been fun on some level. Sometimes when I like doing some events, or people will send me like, "Hey, I did a something on YouTube about the book, or review," and one of the things they'll say is like, "I really enjoyed this book, but the hard part was like I couldn't believe that there would be Black women
Mm.
homesteaders. Like he shouldn't have made that part up." And I'll be like, "Okay, okay." And but the joy of that is if that person is genuinely interested, like in the back of the book, I listed some of the books that I'd read. If they go look at those books, they'll find that stuff. And to me, like the pleasure is if you have an ounce of curiosity about this, there's so much for you to enjoy and soak up. And the next time you drive through Montana or Wyoming, uh, you'll just have such a different picture of what this place was and how it became what it is now.
Hmm. I,
Or you can, at least, if you're interested.
I almost want to ask this question about like how do you feel about I think your novels before, and I think that's very much true of lone women have been treated as almost like correctives. I'm thinking about the Ballad of
Mhm.
Black Tom, where people are like, this is in some ways a response to the legacy of the racism of Lovecraft, and trying to
Right.
spin on that. I mean, how do you think about are the stories you're trying to tell always trying to say, okay, how do we fit in these conversations where people maybe are not used to having them, or telling a story that is going untold in other places?
Well, I would say I think of it in a different way. I think of the excitement for me is, uh, let's say again, back to lone women. Like if you say it's about homesteading in the West in the early 1900s, there's a decent chance you say like, "Oh, I've seen that movie, right? I've read that book." And then I get to be like, "You haven't read this one. I promise you." And like, so it feels more like an opportunity, like I'm a horror head from way back. And one of the great joys, like one of the things that's most exciting about uh certain like moments of greatest excitement with horror is when someone finds a way to use an old trope in a new way, right? And flip it in a way that makes you go, "Oh, I thought that vein had been mined. I thought that thing was dead." And then somebody comes along and says, if you just come at it from this angle, there's so much to do. I mean, the one that pops into my head immediately is Get Out, right? And the idea of saying, in that movie, of saying like, what we are used to is that the white suburban landscape, that is the safe place, right? That is the place that gets invaded. That's not the place that is dangerous. But then if you use this Black body as the main character, at least for me, the minute he enters into that environment, I was like, "You're in trouble. This is not for you." And then when it turns out that the answer was, it's true, like this place, the seemingly upper middle class, liberal, like left wing, right? Because the dad says like I would have voted for Obama for a third time. It's not vilifying like conservative America or anything like that. It's talking about this bastion that the popular media has said this is the safest place on
Hmm.
earth. And then he found a way to say, or is it? And in a way that was fun and exciting and surprising, right? And so for me, like anything that kind of finds a new, I mean, what's his name? Ari Aster with Hereditary and Midsummer, with him saying like, let's say in Hereditary's case in particular, this idea of like the family under siege is the horror trope, and then what you begin to unravel is like, oh no, the evil is in the family, right? And in particular, it's the grandma who is the source of all. Sorry, spoilers, but is the source of all evil. Is one of the people we picture as the sort of epitome of good, no matter your ethnicity, race, whatever, grandma. But in this case, she sacrifices generations of her own people to bring a demon back to life. And for me, it thrills me when people figure out a way to do that and make it work.
I love that. I mean, I think one of my questions was going to be something that you just answered of like, with lone women, you have this story that is already like rich with so many possibilities of like these histories that most people don't know about. So why have this supernatural element that I loved, but just like out of curiosity, why did this element come into play? And I think you've kind of answered that in some ways of like there's a level of people hear the premise and they might think, oh, I've read that already. So this is a way that you can kind of come in slant and show something else. I'm curious though with with the trunk, because there was a moment really early on that I think kind of I don't know. I was like reading through it. Adelaide has gotten her place in Montana, and basically like somebody is trying to break into the trunk, and she kind of has this realization, and I also kind of had this realization that if she doesn't stop this person from opening the trunk, then like basically everybody's fucked because it can just kind of run wild. And it was this moment for me as a reader too of being like, whoa, that really blows up the story and expands it way beyond this very centralized place, because that supernatural element can kind of do whatever it wants when Adelaide's not there. I'm curious, just like with the trunk in this case, like when you're thinking about your stories and thinking about maybe adding some kind of element like that, how does that process go for you? Like where did the trunk come from, and maybe what kind of mindset are you in when you're kind of developing these ideas?
Well, usually the way it works for me is that so I should back up and say part of the reason I love the supernatural or monsters in particular, right, is that monsters get in a way get to tell you how something feels as opposed to how something is, right? So what I mean by that is that let's say uh, you have a family where the father is an alcoholic, right? And you're trying to say, like, how do I teach you how deeply terrifying it is to be with a person who one day is this, the next 5 minutes later is this? How do I convey to you the monstrousness and the terror of that? I could just day by day, I could say to you, today he was great in the morning. And then later in the day, he'd had a few drinks, so he started yelling. And then by night, and I could just lay out the specific factual details of things. Or I could say to you, we were trapped in a hotel, no one but me, my mom, and my dad. And then he became so monstrous, it felt like the hotel had taken him over. He became possessed by a force so evil that it was going to make him murder us. And then he went around that hotel in the book with a mallet, in the movie with an axe, and he tried to kill me and my mother, and the black dude who was the caretaker there, right? And you say, like, on some level, The Shining, let's say, for that example, The Shining gets to be the way that King teaches you how terrifying it would be to imagine that your father, who raised you, wants to kill you, that you believe he would try to kill you. But it can't be just that, like, oh, he got drunk and got violent. It's got to be that there is a force that is pushing him and animating him, and it is thousands of years old or hundreds of years old, whatever it might be, and it has caused evil across generations. That's the only way to convey to a reader how a child would feel when his father turns like that, right? And so in that way, I think the amazing thing about the supernatural, about monsters, is it can teach you the immensity of a feeling in a way that the basic facts often just can't do. At least for me, they just don't do it, right? And so in the case of Lone Women, I guess one of the things I was trying to, without giving anything away, I was trying to wrestle with this question of family and caretaking and the burdens of family, right? Like, I know for almost everyone, family over everything, right, is the phrase. Nothing is more important than family. But my experience has been that, like, sometimes the worst thing for family is other family members. And so how do you convey that? Do you just say, oh, like, so and so stole my money, and then they were mean to me on the playground. It becomes this litany of complaints that people just kind of go, shut up. Nobody believes that. But then you say, like, oh no, every once a month, my brother becomes a werewolf, and me and my mom and my sister and my uncle have to, and my father, I say, have to lock ourselves in a steel room because if that door was opened, he would kill us. And you say, oh, was he a crackhead? Like, to me, I just immediately be like, that's how I would tell you about being in a family with a drug addict, right? Once a month, he becomes a werewolf, and he would kill us if we opened that door. So for me, like, that's the beauty of using the supernatural. And the other part of it is that, like, then also, if people don't really want to read about a family with a drug addict, they could just read about a werewolf, right? They could just enjoy the werewolf. Like, a great thing about a monster is it can also be fun. Like the Shining, that Overlook Hotel is endlessly fun and creepy, right? Even as it helps to be a metaphor for a father who is possessed in a way that would kill his own family, blah, blah, blah. It's just fun. Same with vampires, same with whatever. And so that's what I like about it is you get the deeper meaning and you also get to have fun with the thing.
You're already talking about your approach to horror. I had this question about, one of the things that strikes me a lot about your writing is often the horror to me feels less of like gore or like visceral. Oftentimes the kind of horror that we're dealing with feels like it's this unsettling, I can't quite get my feet on the ground here. I don't fully feel like I understand what's happening, and I'm not sure I feel comfortable in this space. And I think that's certainly true of Changeling. And with this, I mean, one of the things that I was noticing is that sometimes the violence of the book happens off stage. That will come to, and the gore or the like attack or the whatever has already taken place, and we're seeing like the aftermath of it. And so, can you just talk to me about like the ways that you're putting the reader in a space where they're uncomfortable, but we're not necessarily always like really seeing the thing?
Right. Well, the first answer to that is that I'm not a huge gore fan in general. Like if a movie has it, certainly I'll get through it, I'll watch it, whatever like that. But I don't like I can't sit there and enjoy the kills just for the sake of the kills. You know what I mean? Like those aren't the movies. I'll watch them. Maybe I'll enjoy it for the moment, but that's not something I come back to more than once necessarily. And for the people who like that, that's great, But because that's not my impulse, I think it therefore doesn't become the impulse in my writing, because to me, the thing that is horrifying about moments of violence or gore or whatever is who it's happening to, right? Then it really hurts when it's happening to someone I care about, or when I can feel like the writer has, like they actually care about the person or the thing, if it's an animal, being harmed. Then I'm getting it hit on two levels. Like it's not just a piece of meat. It's a let's say it's a person. And who was that person? And it doesn't take much. It might be half a page letting me understand who they are, and then all of a sudden they're off. And to me, those are the most effective scares because they're not jump scares. They're like you say, like they're kind of like the shiver under your skin kind of scare. I'm reading The Stand right now. It's sad to say, as much as I'm a Stephen King fan, I never read it when I was younger, and so a friend encouraged me to read it now, so I'm reading it now. And for me right now, without question, the most affecting deaths, there's a little part in there where he gives you these just vignettes of here's people who were immune to the plague that has killed most of the earth, but that doesn't mean people don't still die, right? In various ways. And there's one in particular about a kid, 5-year-old kid, all his family dies. He's just old enough that he can scavenge and scrounge for himself. But he's wandering trying to find anybody else. And he's living out somewhere in maybe Indiana, I think, or Nebraska. And so he's in a more rural area. And by chance, he walks over an old well that had been covered up, and the wood snaps underneath, and he falls into the water. Both his legs break, and he's down there for 20 hours before he dies. And that made me so sad for like that night and the next day. It was scary to me when just the idea of it. And then I was like, he's fucking 5. And he was like, Stephen, like, couldn't you have at least let him just die from the fall? No, like the horror is there's a 5-year-old in a well with two broken legs, crying in pain. No one on earth, thinking he's the last human on earth, and no one comes to him for 20 hours, and then he dies. Like that is heartbreaking and terrifying and all in a way that like telling me how a buzzsaw cut somebody into three pieces and you lavish the blood and the gore. It's fun, but it doesn't
Mm.
stay, you know. And so for me, again, like just for me, that's my thing. So even when things get gory or extreme, right? Like I know I'm using movies mostly, but that's just because I think probably there's a larger frame of reference for folks, right? But like The Exorcist is pretty gory. Um,
Mhm.
but it hurts because I really feel for that mother and daughter, right? Like there's other movies that do worse to people, and I don't care, like in the least. But that movie takes a little while to show me a single mom. She's trying to raise this kid. It's a sweet kid. And then just purely by chance, this demon decides this is who they're going to torture. And it's not even because it hates them, it's to test the faith of the priests. So they're just tools. And so that even speaks to the sort of the evil of it all is like you don't even this pain doesn't even matter to this demon. It's just to fight God through this priest and just being like, God dang, that's a lot. And man, I love it because it hurts, you know. I hope that answered the
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I really liked about Lone Women is, you know, while it's taking place in kind of this real world setting, I almost felt more grounded by the trunk, like from the start of the book. I think because Adelaide is so connected to it, and I think something really cool that I think you do is, since she's so focused on making sure that this trunk is okay and that the people around the trunk are okay. Um, it opens up all these opportunities, I imagine, for you as the writer to then kind of play with the reader's expectations about other elements of the book. So, like the Mudges, I think was such. I'm not to get too into it, but I just found that those characters to be like awesome. Like I completely did not know. I didn't know where it was gonna go, and I had such like a roller coaster experience of that arc, and I think that is just like another kind of element that I imagine you're allotted when you kind of have this maybe grander thing happening in the forefront. It allows you to kind of play with some of these other elements that might seem a bit innocuous to the reader in the background.
Well, and I have to be honest, they also saved me because they like I was determined to make the what's in the trunk a mystery for a period of time, but I also knew like I'm not gonna write this version where the last page it opens kind of
Yep.
thing. I didn't want to do that because I hate that kind of thing. Right? Like I want a mystery, and then at a certain point I'm like, you got to tell me, just tell me, you know. But what I discovered was like, but if I give you other threats, other things to be concerned about, then you still want to know what this is about, but you're also like, wait, but what about that thing? Like you're like someone like in a haunted house when you're walking through, like where's the scare going to come from, you know, kind of thing. And so the Mudges served a on a writing level, they served just a mechanical purpose, which is they were a new threat that distracted you from the questions about the trunk at least a little bit. Um, and and then they were also again like monsters. They were human monsters, but they were so fun. I was just having so much fun writing them, um, and just like what they got up to. And it did feel like okay, this is just another tool, and it could, and then hopefully the feeling for the reader too was sort of like, oh, I thought this was about one thing, but this is about multiple things or multiple threats to Adelaide and to the lone women, and then that feels also more exciting too, I think.
Yeah, I mean the something that Ben and I were talking about right before you came on was, um, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, but like you kind of find out a little bit about what's in the trunk pretty early on in the book, and like to your point, I found that to be really fascinating because it changes kind of your expectations for the rest of the book and kind of the reader, how they're going through the story after that. And Ben and I were talking about how, we're not big fans of like the mystery box kind of storytelling. No, I just felt that was like a really interesting choice. And was that something that you kind of knew you were always going to do, kind of have this maybe first reveal kind of early on, and then, or did that come just naturally as you were going through it?
No, I mean, I knew, I think they were really talking about, it's probably about 100 pages in, right? Like,
Yeah, less than, I think. Yeah.
yeah. I knew, so for me, so this book began, the first time it began as a long story that was in an anthology that came out, I think it was like 2014, I think, or 2013. And it was an anthology, it was called Long Hidden, and it was an anthology of like speculative historical stories. So they might be sci-fi, fantasy, horror, whatever it is, mystery, thriller, but like taking real history and in some way spinning it in a certain way. And so in that story, the way it ended was with the things, what's in the trunk is revealed, and then it kind of it got resolved in a way that was almost, for lack of a better term, like too happy, considering the truth of considering like the thing that what was in the trunk and what its relationship to Adelaide was always there, right? But the way it ended in the story kind of like, kind of said like, and they lived happily ever after, but didn't interrogate Adelaide or the parents in any deeper way. Right. And what I knew was I expanded to the non. In fact, like I shouldn't say I knew. In fact, I had a conversation with somebody who said to me, like, I enjoyed this, but in the end, it feels like the thing in the trunk never got its due. Like, just to leave it somewhat vague. And I took that and I was sort of like, huh, okay, let me think about that. And I took a couple of years thinking about that. And I realized like, oh, sorry, this pause for a second. I don't know.
Sure.
This is just I'll turn my phone off. There's just a spam risk calling me, but I don't know if it's something that plays on so I'm just going to turn off the phone entirely. Apologies.
No worries.
But it when they said that, I felt like, oh, there's a deeper version of this story. And for me, like I hate stories where the main character is just flawless, right? Where they're right, or more importantly, forget they're right. They're wronged by the world. You're sympathetic to them, and we agree the world is terrible, but they are special and good. And that's the end of the story, right? Like I understand the appeal of that, right? Like everyone likes to think, oh, I only do good things and the world is terrible to me and I'm going to triumph over the world. That's wonderful to say, to believe, right? But that's not true. Like even the best person in the world harms other people all the time in ways great and small. And so I'm a sucker for that. Like where you think, oh, this is my person. They've been wronged by the world, mistreated by the world. I'm all in with them. And then partway through you realize, oh, but they also do bad things. Or like forget bad things. They also fail in some way, fail other people in some way. So it doesn't mean that they do evil, but it just means they're not perfect. And so when I realized the book had room for that, it was a way for me to interrogate Adelaide. And by doing that, it was, frankly, a way to interrogate myself and my own things that I'm wrestling with at the point when I was writing that book, and trying to figure out like my own culpability in things in my family. And then, okay, so what might be a way that everyone could come out of this, changed for the better, but also having to deal with their shit. And to me, that was a journey that I was excited to go on, but it required on some level revealing the mystery box sooner.
Right. And is something that I think like ultimately what you do such a good job of, and what like really works for me is that early reveal allows you just keep complicating the story, and that's what's like interesting as a reader, is like when things just are getting more complex as you go and adding those
Thanks.
layers of depth.
I hope it, I mean, I always hope it feels like it's
Yeah.
additive, right? Like not just complicated just for the sake of complication, but yeah, but the more time, like with anything, the more time you spend with a person, the more you come to see their flaws as well as their strengths, you know.
Yeah. I kind of wanted to ask you this question. I was refreshing my memory about Changeling because I read it a couple of years back, and I like went back to the New York Times review of it, and great lengths were spent to be like, what does Victor write? Like, here are all the ways that it's a mashup of all these different genres. Is it literature? Is it
Yes.
horror? Is it supernatural? Is it social criticism? I'm wondering, I kind of just want to ask you like how much any of that matters to you, or like what you think about like, oh, this is the thing that I'm trying to do, or is it just like you're content to have people being like, I'm breaking a sweat, how do I describe like what's going on here?
I think what I've come to be content with is that for a certain subset of the world's readers, they will say, I want whatever ride it is that Victor is going to
Hmm.
give me, right? Uh, and I will say, like, sometimes I do think about, like, one of the things that people appreciate is like Martin Scorsese, you're going to give me a gangster story, right? Which is why sometimes it can be, I think, it doesn't land as well when you're like, oh no, this is about Tibet. This is a
Hmm.
story about Tibet, or or no, this one's about Jesus.
Yeah.
That people come sometimes kind of go, what,
Yeah.
what? But what I appreciate is that what leads his, let's say in his case, what leads him is his artistic interest, as opposed to people want gangster films from me, I give them gangster films, right? That can be great. Like someone, that they're reliably going to give you some great action in a movie, um, and and that's what what's his name is a great example, Michael Bay, right? As much as I know people say whatever they say about the variety of things, that dude knows how to make action unbelievably kinetic, sometimes confusing, but unbelievably kinetic and beautiful, right? Like I think, I mean, as much as let's say those Transformers movies, particularly like the first and second one, some of those Transformer battles on their own are perfect. They're beautiful. That one where that Transformer skates through a bus and then they're just attacking each other. It's beautiful, right? And if you didn't have to have a whole narrative built around it, I could watch just like those set pieces from him because you can see that's where his all his genius goes. And I do think he's a genius for those things, you know. And then he gets bit like then he makes Pain and Gain, which I think is a pretty wonderful movie, and people don't go see it because they're just like, I don't get it. It's about crime from Michael Bay. The Rock is in it. What? But it's a great movie. If people haven't seen it, it's a lot of fun. So that's a long way to say that there is a commercial appeal to doing what it says on the tin every single time. And I just keep failing to do it. Like, I'm not saying I refuse to do it because I'm some sort of like, I'm too artistic to do it. I start doing let's say the Changeling, maybe I started that as like, hey, marriage is beautiful, but it's also hard work. And then it gets even harder when you have a kid. And then at some point in there, I'll go like, and what if New York was full of pockets of weird fairy magic? And what if a baby got kidnapped? And what if there was, and it just builds and builds, but like I'm having so much fun and I feel deeply invested in the idea that like that sense of fun comes through the page, right? And that's what I can give. It's not that I'm better than the other version that just does one thing and just gives it, and it's not that I disdain it. I can't do
Hmm.
it. And so I lean into like this is what I can do. Like if you're the kind of person when you eat dinner, you separate all your foods and you eat them individually, I'm not your chef. But if you like if you mix up your food on the plate, I'm telling you, I might be for you. That is the way I think of it
I really, really love that.
now.
Um, Maybe in kind of keeping with that, how do you think about, because obviously you're someone who, writes for comics, you write novels. My assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you are involved in some of the scripting for some of the TV shows that you're working on.
Yes.
How is it working, switching between some of those different mediums?
Well, the biggest change, whether you're talking about comics or TV, is just collaboration. Like what I am used to as a fiction writer is, for better or worse, I'm the boss of all the choices. Like my editor will give me notes. My wife, who's also a writer, gives me notes. My best friend, my agents, all of them give notes sort of like that. But in the end, I make the choices and we go from there. Sink or swim, I'm the one who makes those choices. But in comics, as much as the writing is important, it's a visual medium. And you have to work well with your artist, because that artist will do things on the page with the visuals that your words will never convey. And like I've been a fan of comics that were beautiful to look at and terribly written, but I've never been a fan of a comic that's well written and ugly to look at. I just can't do it. And then if you talk about TV, then you're collaborating in theory. If it gets to the point where it starts to get cast, and then you start to have like a whole team of people who are going to bring it to life, you're collaborating with maybe 50
Hmm.
people, right? And all of them want to have a say in things, not because they're trying to change your vision, but because whatever your vision is has inspired them in some way. That's why they applied for the job or took the job or whatever it is. But now you have to give them room to, like, it's not what you were picturing, but then what they bring is better than what you were picturing. And you have to be open to that, as opposed to saying, no, it's only got to be what I saw in my head. Because then why hire anybody, you know? And the more important part of that is, whether you're talking about the comics with the artist or TV with all these people, what is also true is, like, just because you're the writer doesn't mean you have the best idea all the time. And the best kind of leader is the leader who says, everyone's ideas can work, and I will genuinely use someone else's idea if it's better than what I had. But it takes time
Yeah.
to get to that place.
Yeah, I really empathize with that last statement, especially because like Ben and I both like have like more of a literary, whatever you want to call that, writing background, like going to MFAs and stuff like that. And at the beginning of the year, I ended up taking a job working in the narrative department of a video game studio, and that collaborative element that you're talking about has been really interesting. I think probably more so for writers, because I think we're just so egotistical that, myself included, like there's so many times where I'm like, well, clearly my idea is the best. And it's been a learning process of like acknowledging, like, no, my idea isn't always the best, and like in fact it's actually really interesting, and thought provoking and fulfilling to like work with other people's ideas in your own, and like kind of make this narrative together. And I'm curious for you, now that the Changeling is going to be coming out soon, and from what I read, I think Lone Women has also already been sold the rights.
We uh, started working on that right up until the strike. Like, I had my last
Yeah,
meeting for that the day before we called
Oh
the
wow.
strike.
yeah. I'm curious, like, what's your philosophy been like for like adapting your work? Are you somebody who, I mean, you kind of were just getting at it a bit, but like, do you foresee these adaptations to be pretty in line with like the narrative that you created, or are you somebody who's kind of like, oh, you want it to be a different thing?
Well, in the case of the Changeling, uh, there was a woman who is the creator and writer of the show, a woman named Kelly Marcel, super talented, an unbelievable advocate. She came on as the creator of the show in 2017, and like became immediately, like, came out and met me for lunch and said, like, we're going to do this together, right? Which is very rare, as I'm sure you know, because most of the time, the producers, the channel, they don't want the egotistical fiction writer fighting with maybe the showrunner who is the boss, if you're talking about the TV version, right? Uh, Better to just you pay the author a little money or a ton of money, whatever it is, and if you can, you just tell them, "Thank you very much. We'll take it from here." But that was
Mm-hmm.
not Kelly's way. Kelly said, "I want you to be working on this with me," and she stuck to that. So she wrote the whole first season. It's 8 episodes, but the way we worked it, she would write the scripts and then she would send them to me and then I would give her any notes that I had and then she would work on it a little more and then she would send it to the producers. But she and I would always have the first conversation or one of the first conversations about what was in there. And I'm in many ways very lucky because the show is absolutely it's the book in many many ways. Like all she wanted, what she wanted to do was additive, meaning like in the Changeling, you spend all your time with Apollo as the main character, the husband and father is the main character. But Kelly said, I also want to give Emma, the wife, more energy and space and time. And she was a new mother at the time because so she felt like you were writing it very much from the point of view of the new father, the new dad. I want to write also from the perspective of the new mom. And I just wanted, so the great thing was I hadn't done that. That wasn't in my
Mm.
book. So everything she's adding is only like icing on top because it's doing this thing that I couldn't or didn't do. And all it's adding to is like the pleasure of it is she found a way in her brilliance so that you're seeing Apollo's journey and then you're seeing essentially Emma's take on the same situations, not like what was it? Not like Rashomon or something like that. They're not like
Mm-hmm.
uh, um, they're not disputing each other, but it's more like he takes the kid to a book off on a book hunt and you're seeing him blah 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 and then you see her first day at
Mm.
work whereas in the
Mm-hmm.
book you just saw Apollo go on his trip and then on her trip you start to see the ways that some of the weird insidious things they start happening to her because a lot of that stuff happened off the page. She would just be reporting it, so now you get to see how it was really affecting her. um, so in a way I think I got a little spoiled because Kelly's touch was so graceful and so kind to the book, um, that we didn't like. There was never a thing where she said like, "Oh, I'm just going to take out that entire storyline. I'm going to remove that character," which is pretty common stuff. Um, for Lone Women, which I'm at like that, I'm writing it right now. I've written the pilot, and if we come back from a strike, we'll presumably hopefully open a room, and then I'll lead the room and all this kind of stuff. But in a weird way, I'm being much more uh, deconstructive with Lone Women because it's maybe in a way because it's mine.
Mm.
So I don't, in a weird way, like what I've come to feel is like I don't have to be precious about it because the book exists. You know what I mean? So sometimes writers, I do have friends who are writers who have had things adapted and they've changed a ton of stuff and they're pretty angry about it. You know, like, I don't like this. They got rid of this. They didn't use this, blah, blah, blah. But the take I've had on it all along is like, nothing changes the book. The book is on the
Mm.
shelf, right? So if people want to know what your vision was as the author, they just read the book. The
Mm-hmm.
thing, sometimes I think the petulance or the heartbreak on the part of the fiction writer, the novelist or the short story writer, is knowing deep down, like, compared to this show, no one's going to read that book. So they're not going to know my vision, right? Like all my brilliance is hidden on the page. Why didn't they put it on the screen? Like I think sometimes that's part of the anger. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but but if you can let go of that, like so for Lone Women, like it's not that I'm not suddenly setting it on Mars or anything like that, but I'm sort of doing a little bit more playing with the journey out there, playing with some characters in different ways, like building up different kinds of threats. And I feel totally at ease about it because, again, like, because if someone wants to say, like, it's not like the book, I'll say, because it's not a book, it's a show. And the show has different demands, you know? And it feels very fun to maybe be steering both ships. you know.
Victor, before we get to our next question, and maybe last, do you have a hard out here?
I would say probably if 3:30
Okay.
my
Okay.
time, so another half hour would be.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't have to go that long, but that would be
Okay.
probably the
We'll get you
latest.
out of here before then. Phil,
This is a good
do you want to
conversation.
ask that literary question?
Yeah. Yeah. I as when we were prepping for talking with you, we were just reading through some other interviews, and something that I really was drawn to was, and I think it was in Esquire, you were talking about how during the release of your first two books, you were kind of chasing this idea of like literary fiction and how it has to be kind of entrenched in misery, and like kind of good literary work is like serious and sad most of the time. And what you realized, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like what you were talking about is like what you realized is that it was making writing not very fun for you anymore. And moving more into like this speculative direction opened up so many more possibilities and brought joy back to your process. And I think that whole idea is something that Ben and I have definitely grappled with, like from all the way back from like undergrad all the way through grad school. I think during my time in school, there was so much of a push for students to not write like science fiction or fantasy. Yep. Yeah. Cause it's not, literary. And I think we're kind of in a better place now, but I've found that even, now that I'm a couple years out of my programs, I still have that voice in the back of my head saying like, Phil, that sci-fi you want to write, that's not like the real stuff. And I've been trying to push myself to get rid of those negative thoughts. And there's not really a question there. I just found like what you were saying to be really, really impactful. And like, I can empathize a lot with that
Yeah, well,
position.
I'm very glad. I mean, the other thing I would say is uh, what's always fair and what's always, I think, maybe useful is to say that wasn't actually true about literary fiction. That was my perception, right? I mean, because there's satirists who are considered literary fiction. I mean, there's humor and I don't know who Gary Steingart, somebody like that, who is very popular and very funny, but still, I think falls under a rubric of literary fiction as opposed to I don't know what. Even he had I mean, Super Sad True Love Story is a sci-fi, really. It's kind of a dystopian story, right? But it still falls under that rubric of literary realism slash Steingart kind of fiction, meaning very funny stuff and insightful. So it was my perception that misery was the default emotion of literary fiction. And I do think for a lot of students, it's the place we went to, right? Because you're sort of saying, like, well, in the span of a short story, or even in the expanse of a novel, how do I like get people, shake them to their core? What is the stuff that matters, whatever? And there is a bias toward the idea, I think broadly speaking, there's a bias toward the idea that it's pain that implies importance or value, right? It's pain that creates the profound uh, uh, sense of value on the
Mm-hmm.
page. And what I started to do actually was in the last couple of years, every other semester, maybe two, I'll teach a class I call First Novels, um, and we'll read novels that writers think they know, right? By writers that they respect and trust and blah, 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 and say like, oh, those are the great, blah, 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 whatever it is. Um, and and then we'll actually look at the novels and come to see, let's say, forget first novels, just like this is even a broader conversation about novels. We say like, do you think the tone of this book is one tone? Let's say Moby Dick, right? Is
Perfect
a book
example.
that people revere, but not always
Yeah.
read, right? Um, and then when we read through it together, we see the comedy that's in it. We see it's like actually a very silly book, sometimes, and then it's a philosophical book, and then it's kind of an adventure book, like the whole thing where Queequeg gets stuck in the head of a whale. Oh no, not Queequeg. He cuts out the guy who's stuck in the head of the whale, and he swims out. That's like a Michael Bay movie. That's easily a scene in a Michael Bay movie, and all of these things, and it's also like a deep story about melancholy as a kind of like uh as a psychological concern that Melville was writing about from his own personal experience. And then it's also a metaphor. The Pequod is a metaphor for the United States and for all the different kinds of people who are stuck on this ship together. And then the whale is a chance to talk about whiteness as a concept. And he's doing this then. You know what I mean? Like, it's all these things. But when a thing becomes sort of a classic, it gets flattened. Right? I'm talking about like Moby Dick or Beloved, right? Mm-hmm. Beloved is a ghost story, right? And a story about grief as a form of ghost that haunts us. But nobody would say, I don't take Beloved seriously because there's a ghost in it, right? But that's because it has ascended, right? But if that book had come out on a small press, I promise you, it would not have won the Pulitzer Prize. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Like, it would have just been, you read this weird book by this Black lady who works full-time as an editor. Like, that's what that book would be, So more than anything, what I took away, this is a long way of saying, what I started to say instead was like, these books that I love are actually these various mashups of genres, right? Or moods at the very least, right? There's humor, contemplative, there's drama, there's tons more action than I gave it credit for, because in my memory, I only remember the scenes of great grief or philosophy or whatever. And it gave me, when I really started to look at the books, it gave me a new freedom, to say, oh, like that thing that I thought I was supposed to write, that no teacher even said to me, you have to do this. It was more like we all had there was like an unstated sort of list of rules. And if you asked anyone in that room, even the professor, who came up with these rules, nobody could tell you, right? But whether it's only write in first person, not third. Now it's only write in second, not first. Then it becomes, it's got to be autofiction. No. Now it's got to be reportage. No, now it's... And it's endless, and you don't understand who made up these rules. And after a time, you start to realize, like, I don't think anybody made up these rules. I think they're just sort of like weird floating ideas that are kind of shared on a underground basis and are ruining everybody's enjoyment, And so in that way, like, what I took out of my time in the MFA was, there were a number of skills that the literary realism I was learning under gave to me. And they were about like beauty of language and depth of character in particular, right? And maybe playing with time in certain ways, but in particular, those two things. And as much as, so the genre I grew up on is horror, I love it deeply, not always known for beauty of language. And also not always known for depth of character. The great stuff, yes. But the middle of the road stuff, not really. And so what I said was like, okay, I'm going to take the two things that literary realism does well, and I'm going to put them into stories where things actually happen. Now I got something. And then I'm going to add in monsters. Ooh, now I'm getting excited. And then in more recent years, saying like, and it's going to be based on real history. And I start to go, these are some nice elements I got here, right? And I just slot them in together. But it takes some time to have confidence that I can take all those tools and make use of them for the books that I want to write. Right. So like, it's the big thing for me was just, it wasn't to say, well, screw the MFA, screw literary realism. It was more to say, I'm taking what you do best, and then I'm going to add it to the things in the genres, what my genres do best. And when you put them all together, that's a thing that is even better than either of these two things on their own.
I really resonate with everything that you're saying. I think we both really do. We talk about this all the time, where it's like, this stuff that we feel like we quote unquote should be writing again. Where did we get this idea from? We're like, does this suck? Are we miserable like doing this? And then the stuff that we're like, oh, this is like pretty fun. We keep coming back to like, but is it good though? It's probably not good.
Yeah.
Even though that's like maybe the stuff that we're enjoying the most.
Well, and that also leans into, I think, the narrative that exists that like you're not supposed to enjoy this.
Yeah.
Right? Like the serious people don't enjoy creating their art. It's supposed to be filled with angst. It's supposed to be filled with, but I think some people are just unhappy people. Like even when they're doing a good thing, like the state of normal is to be in a place where they're never quite satisfied. And you say, that's great for you, but that is not the standard, right? I'm a person who does best when I'm happy doing the thing I'm doing, and I can feel happy doing that. And in fact, from my end, the thing that I have to get pulled back on, and it's my editor who does this, because my editor, he's published, I think, 6 out of 7 of my books at this point. He hates all things horror and speculative. Like he loathes it, right? And so what he's good for is like, it's great you're having a good time, but this doesn't make any sense. Or it's great you're having a good time, but I don't understand what this is supposed to even be about. And that's necessary too, right? Because it's sort of like, oh no, it's a coven of werewolves who are also witches. And then at a certain point, the aliens come, and he goes, stop it. Just stop it. What does this mean? I don't understand. Why are the werewolves witches? And I go, I just thought it was fun. And he goes, that's not a reason. Right? So that's the other side of it, is like, just fun is also not enough. Right? It's also like, it's fun. And then, but if I can say to him like, well, they're witches because, I mean, I can't think of a reason off the top of my head, but if I came up with a good one, then he'll be like, okay, I get that, but can we lose the aliens? And I go, all right, no aliens.
I love that. Victor, thanks so much for talking with us. I feel like, you've been talking to a lot of people that work in the games industry, and I think it's always good to get back to just more like fiction writers, because I think it's a good moment for Ben and I to get some of these pep talks of like, you know what, just write your weird fucking novels already, So
well, but you're also, I could imagine for the folks in video games, I could imagine it's maybe similar to some of the conversations I have with people in TV and film. Like, there's so much money riding on something working, right? That you can't just go on whims. Whatever, every choice has to in some way appeal to, I'm guessing, at least a couple million people, right?
Yeah.
And so in a way, the reason I'm so happy each time I come back to fiction is I don't gotta please anybody in this early stage except me and my imagined reader. And my imagined reader is my ideal reader, the one who gets all my little references, who loves the genre mashup, all that kind of stuff. And in the end, I can believe that they're like, for a book to get, you only need a few thousand people. You don't need 5 million people to like that. Be nice, but you don't need it, And so I can imagine, like, to give credit to the game people, it's I can't imagine that amount of pressure to be appealing, right? But that's why it's great that we can also write fiction.
Yeah.
I think this is a good place to end and just say we really appreciate you coming to talk to us.
I feel like that's the most pep talkish I'm ever going to get. Like where we just ended there. So that's probably for the best.
Gonna save it, and that's my alarm now.
Yes.
That's what I wake up to every morning.
Well, Phillip, Ben, this was a great time. I appreciate you having me on.
That was our conversation with Victor LaValle about his new novel, Lone Women, about speculative fiction, and everything else in between. Ben, how are you feeling after talking to Victor?
I feel great, and I also feel like, it's interesting. I feel like we get done with every conversation, and then I'm like, time to go back and engage with every single thing that they've done now. And that's kind of how I felt like after this conversation, where I was like, there's some stuff in the back catalog that I had been meaning to get to, and now I'm like, in earnest, it's time to get to that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Victor LaValle is somebody that, I've been aware of for a number of years, mainly through you and then this like different like properties. But I haven't spent a lot of time reading his work, and Lone Women was the first novel of his that I've checked out. And yeah, I think, for one, reading the book, it's just like a joy to read. Like his prose is like really like approachable and nice, but then also talking to him, I feel like I learned a lot about, I mean, if anything, like kind of like confidence in your writing, and like how much of that is kind of trusting your own process and, leading into the things that you enjoy, and that like the weirdness that you enjoy, and not necessarily worrying about, outside forces.
Yeah, I really love his like, I don't really, to some extent, I'm not too worried about like where I fit. And also like, I'm just going to write this stuff that feels good and feels like I enjoy it. Because that's stuff that you and I talk about all the time, struggling with, where it's like, the stuff that's fun, I don't know if it's the stuff that I should be doing. And I think it's like, it feels good hearing that from someone who, is a professor or knows what they're doing, like is very well published. And so I think like there's something that allows that to resonate and hit in a way where it's like, when you and I are talking, we're like, but should we be doing the fun stuff, or should we be doing the miserable stuff that feels like it's more literary?
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about this conversation, I feel like listeners, if you've, found out about the show more recently, another episode that I kind of feel like this is in conversation with is with the Gina Nutt episode about night rooms, because, obviously that book is nonfiction, and I think in that conversation we kind of get into Gina Nutt's affinity toward horror as a way to work through various life experiences, whether it be like mental illness or suicide, dealing with loss and grief and things like that. I kind of feel like this conversation with Victor does a really good job of maybe giving us that other puzzle piece in terms of why, horror is such a great catalyst for, dealing with really complex experiences. Like his whole thing about monsters, and how using monsters is a great way to actually think about how something feels versus just literally showcasing how something is. That's something that I'm really like chewing on in my own work right now.
Yeah, no, and I think like horror as a genre is really good about this, which is like when it's good, when it's not the kind of, and I'm about to get myself into trouble here, but like the schlocky gore stuff, and there's been a slate, right? I think we're in a really great moment for horror, where you have a lot more, like we're getting a lot more of these movies that are like intellectual, in the sense that like there's the visceral horror that's like happening, but it's secretly about something else, right? And I think we've gotten a lot of those. Get Out was mentioned. I feel like we bring up Babadook in these conversations a lot. It Follows, which I know we're both really big fans of, is always a part of conversations around this stuff, where it's like, oh, we're actually kind of talking about something else, but we're using horror tropes to like get into that conversation. And Victor, I think, is really great at being like, yeah, like this is a way to make that very specific trauma or that very specific life experience actually more relatable and more of a thing that anyone can kind of sit down and watch. And I think that's true, right? Where it's like that, when I talk about how much I love It Follows to people, there's plenty of people who are just like, that's a fun time, and like that's it. And then there are people who are like, yeah, like let's get into this conversation about like life and how our adolescence has escaped us, and it feels like death is around the corner, and we're becoming adults in ways that we don't necessarily like feel like we have control over, and so it's like, you can start having these double conversations. And I think like you and I are people who are like, let's have that secondary conversation, but also like it is worthwhile when a thing can work on those two levels and also just be like a pretty good time.
Yeah, I mean, I think another example that just springs into my head is Nope, Jordan Peele's most recent film, as being like a great example of kind of, well, it's maybe less horror, horror-ish as his last two. I think it still also kind of speaks to some of what Victor is getting at with like using a monster as a way to work through like a very kind of hard to grasp hold of theme around like being seen and spectacle and and things like that. So I thought that was really interesting. And then just Victor's whole process about like visiting a place that maybe he doesn't think he'll be able to return to and buying a book of local history as a way to kind of re-engage with that place, I found to be really interesting. And Ben, I don't know if you were thinking of this, but something when we were talking about Montana, I had to stop myself from kind of going down this tangent, but I was just thinking
I know exactly what you're going to say. I know exactly what you're going to fucking say.
Victor talks about like, going to Montana and being a city guy and not really having any kind of perspective on what Montana was. And I think like I can speak for myself in saying that, and it sounds like you too, Ben, like I didn't really have an idea of what Montana would be like, but when we did our road trip back in 2015, in a different way, I feel like I also had that experience of like being out of my element, but also really intrigued by what Montana actually was.
Yeah, I mean, that was when he was bringing that up, that was my first thought was like, oh, wow, I remember feeling like we got to have that experience with the Looncast, our old podcast for folks who don't know, where we kind of traveled around the country and went to a bunch of different places exploring themes of death, belief, and the supernatural. But one of the experiences that I felt like we got to have was going to a city, and then because we were like interested in history or interested in talking to local experts, we got to have this like, oh, here's the kind of maybe surface level tourist experience, and then like here's the like in-depth conversation that is gonna be the thing that you think about for the next like 17 hours while you're sitting in the car, where you're like actually maybe learning something more nuanced about the history of a place. And like that stuff was really cool, and I think that is kind of what he's talking about here, is like, oh, maybe I only touched this place briefly, but I want to know more about it.
Yeah, and I'll have a shameless plug and be like, y'all, you should check out the Looncast. I think Ben and I and our two friends, Shira and Evan, did a really good job with that show, and I think the Montana one episode in particular is really interesting because we visited this ghost town that was like in the mountains of Montana, and got to meet some eccentric folks out there. And it's funny, like, after that experience that we had on the road trip, I went to grad school and I kind of wrote essays about that experience, but I've never really thought about thinking about those histories that we engaged with as a stomping ground for like potential fiction stories. And I thought that was also interesting with Victor's kind of ethos of like, with Lone Women specifically, of kind of taking the historical and having all of the historical elements be based in fact, and then having one or a few supernatural elements that he could then kind of shake the boat with. I felt like that was a really interesting approach, and one that I bet kind of gave him a lot of freedom and fun, which I think it's kind of clear on the page, like a lot of fun to be had with that kind of setting.
Yeah. And just like what a good, smart prompt. And I loved how much he talked about like the history stuff like really mattering, and like getting it right really mattering, which is like, yeah, it was just very cool. I think it's easy in a book of fiction, and especially like supernatural fiction, to be like, yeah, sure, this is like all made up, but it's pretty sweet, I think, to be like, no, like there are some elements of this that are made up, but most of it is like extremely well researched and like definitely happened.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of feel I don't know if is there other things, Ben, that we haven't touched on that you feel like we should.
I feel like it's worth just talking about like it is cool to me that he's kind of having this moment with like his stuff getting adapted into TV shows. There were two books that were like a huge, I think like had a big moment in trying to grapple with the racist legacy of Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft. And one of those was Lovecraft Country, which got adapted into a frankly mediocre show, but like was a book that I like really enjoyed, of short stories. And I remember around the time when that show was coming out, a lot of people being like, yo, what's going to happen with the Ballad of Black Tom? Like that was like a really cool story. And so I didn't ask him because it was like, I feel like it's an old enough work of his that maybe you get tired of, hearing questions about it. And also like there's clearly these other shows that he's working on right now, but that was like a really impactful book for me where I was like, wow, this is just like really cool, really smart. It's like doing all of the things that, when we talk about like what Victor is doing, where it's like, oh, like we're doing horror, but we're also doing social commentary and we're also doing, surrealist fiction. Like he's doing all of that stuff in a way that's just like also packaged in a book that is, I think it's a novella, and it's just really fun. And so it's cool that he's kind of having this moment, because I think that he's also someone who's like very engaged in the conversation about like what is horror and what should horror be doing. I ended up picking up, and I remember sharing with you, like he had the New York Times review of Stephen King's The Outsider. And so like that ended up being the reason that I read The Outsider. And that was all about like, I think it was like how he was appreciating King's approach to writing characters who came from a different background than him. Because I think in that there are some non-white characters, and he was like, oh, like this, some of what King's doing feels like really good in the ways that he's like not taking on the POV of these people, but still like trying to understand them and make them sympathetic from a gaze that is like outside of their experience in a really interesting way. And I'll plug that review too. But I think like, yeah, I feel like he's someone who's been like in the horror sphere and has like been around those conversations, and so it's like cool to see his stuff like blowing up in a bigger way, I feel like.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the other kind of element to that that I kind of took away, and it's not necessarily like this revelatory statement, but I think he did a really good job of unpacking like the whole part of our conversation around like literary fiction versus speculative fiction, and how oftentimes books that kind of end up getting like a lot of praise for being like literary, oftentimes the inherent weirdness that they embody gets flattened. So he talks about like Moby Dick or Toni Morrison's Beloved as being these works that are deeply weird. They're deeply genre oriented, with a lot of different things happening on the page, but oftentimes, especially if you're somebody who's been in like grad school or something like that, you're kind of trained to not kind of engage with maybe the more genre genre with air quotes elements of writing. And I think he just does a good job of kind of acknowledging, well, like that whole idea just isn't true, and like all great writing is similar to what Austin was talking about a couple episodes ago. All great writing is kind of interdisciplinary, it's intersectional, it's engaging with all these different things, and that's what makes it interesting, right?
Yeah, and I really, I think like if there's a thing that I've been chewing on the most post interview, it's that this stuff is allowed to be and often is like goofy and weird, and the conversations that we have around the canon is that it's like all like boring and stuffy, and I don't know where that's coming from, but like a lot of it is like messy and strange and weird, and like that should make you feel okay about some of the more like genre elements, if that's the stuff that you end up enjoying.
Yeah. So if anything, as is the case with every writer conversation we have. We need to finish our goddamn books somehow, some way. But
listen,
you know,
this is the year. This is finally the year. This is where it's going to happen.
Yeah, 2023. We might be dead next year anyway. So
we're probably going to choke to death when everything goes up in flames. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it already has, but you know, we're still waiting on the smoke to get us. If you enjoyed this conversation, you should check out Victor's new book, Lone Women, which is available anywhere that you would buy a book. Also available on Kindle and all the e-readers and things like that. If you enjoyed this conversation, also consider leaving a review on the various platforms. We've been seeing y'all kind of hyping us up on social media, and we appreciate that. So, keep it rolling.
Love you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again for checking out the show. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, it is 3D Cisco on Twitter as well as Instagram. And you can follow Ben on Twitter at sad_radio_lad. We wanted to thank Melody Hirsch, who designed all the awesome cover art and design work for the website and the podcast itself. And we wanted to thank Ryan Hopper, who does all the intro and outro music, as well as some of the interstitial stuff you hear in different episodes. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left a review on iTunes, subscribed on either iTunes or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. Reviews help just get the show in front of more people, and it only takes a couple of minutes. If you could do that for us, it'd be greatly appreciated.
You should also visit our website at www.originstory.show. It's a great place to look at all of our episodes. There are full transcripts and a link to our Discord channel where we talk with listeners about everything OS and beyond. There's a lot of posting that goes on in there, so I don't know. If you're into that, come join us. You can also email us at theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. We're always looking for feedback, whether it's ideas for games that we should play, books that we should read, guests that we should have on the show. Just hit us up with thoughts, feelings. We're always looking for feedback, even if it's that Ben has an annoying voice and you don't want to hear it anymore. I mean, that's totally fine. So write us in. You can also follow us on Twitter at @originstory_, or our Instagram at originstory.show. As always, thanks for listening.